Miss Marple and the Order to Close the Knitting Circle. Welcome, dear listeners, to Cafe Tales. I'm your host, Allie, and I want to begin by saying how truly grateful I am for each of you who chooses to spend your time here. It warms my heart to know that these stories bring comfort and joy to such a wonderful community of listeners. Preparing every mystery takes time and care, but seeing how much you enjoy them makes it all worthwhile. It means the world to me that our little community continues to grow, and I'm delighted that so many of you are part of it. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing. It helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more stories to enjoy together. Now let us step quietly into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Notice and Needles. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of St. Mary Me Parish rooms, casting long golden rectangles across the worn linoleum floor where the Women's Institute Knitting Circle had gathered for their weekly meeting. It was Thursday, the 24th of March, 1955, and spring was making its tentative appearance in the village after a particularly harsh winter. Miss Jane Marple sat in her usual chair by the window, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she worked on a pale blue baby jacket, destined for her great-niece's expected arrival. Around her, the comfortable murmur of feminine voices rose and fell in that peculiar rhythm that accompanies communal handicraft. A stitch dropped here, a pattern query there, and the gentle undercurrent of village gossip that flows as naturally as breathing in small English communities. Plain 2, purl 2, and then you increase on the next row, Lady Bantry was explaining to Mrs. Carmichael, who had taken up knitting with more enthusiasm than skill since her retirement from the post office. Though I must say, Dolly, she added, using the familiar name that had stuck since childhood, your tension is improving remarkably. Mrs. Beatrice Larkin, the circle's convener, presided from her position near the small table that held the tea things. A brisk woman in her 50s, with steel-gray hair pinned in a neat victory roll, she maintained order with the same efficiency she brought to her role as head librarian. The key box for the parish room sat at her elbow, a battered tin that had seen better days but still served its purpose admirably. "Has anyone seen the latest stitchcraft?" asked Mrs. Pike, the postmistress, looking up from an intricate cable pattern. "There's supposed to be a lovely Fair Isle jumper pattern that would suit my nephew perfectly." "I believe it's in the magazine rack," replied Mrs. Larkin, not pausing in her examination of a complex Aran design. "Though you might want to check with Lottie. She's been reorganizing the cupboards again." Lottie Briggs, the parish room's caretaker, looked up from her corner where she was mending a dropped stitch with the patient concentration of someone who understood that small problems, if left unattended, could become large ones. A sturdy woman of indeterminate middle age, she possessed the invaluable quality of being both thoroughly reliable and practically invisible, the sort of person upon whom the smooth running of community life depended entirely. "Everything's properly sorted now," Lottie said with satisfaction. "Had a good go at the cupboards yesterday after the Mothers' Union meeting. That partition's been sticking something dreadful. Had to give the pins a proper seeing to." The partition in question was one of those concertina affairs that divided the main hall when smaller gatherings required privacy. Like most parish hall furniture, it had seen decades of faithful service and bore the inevitable scars of community use. "Speaking of the Mothers' Union," said Mrs. Larkin, consulting her watch, "we should be clear of here by 4. They've got their special speaker coming at 5. It was precisely 4 when the afternoon's tranquility was disturbed by the arrival of Mr. Alfred Dobson, the parish clerk. He entered with his characteristic mixture of importance and diffidence, carrying the afternoon post in a manila folder pressed against his chest like a shield. "Ladies," he said, nodding gravely to the assembled company. His thin frame was impeccably dressed in a dark suit that had been pressed to within an inch of its life, and his sparse hair was combed with mathematical precision. "I trust I'm not interrupting anything vital." "Not at all, Mr. Dobson," replied Mrs. Larkin warmly. "Just our usual Thursday gathering. Is there something we can help you with?" "Actually, there's a matter that requires Mrs. Larkin's immediate attention," he said, extracting a single sheet of paper from his folder with the reverence of a priest handling a sacred relic. This arrived with the afternoon delivery. Mrs. Larkin set down her knitting and accepted the document, her expression changing from mild curiosity to bewilderment as she read. The paper was headed with an official blue banner proclaiming Rural District Council and bore what appeared to be a formal typed notice. "What on earth?" she murmured, and then in a voice that carried clearly across the suddenly quiet room, "Ordered to close the knitting circle forthwith. By authority of Bylaw 14B, established 1937, the Women's Institute Knitting Circle is hereby commanded to cease all activities in the St. Mary Me Parish rooms for safety reasons. Effective immediately." The room fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock and the distant sound of a motor car passing on the village street. Even the click of knitting needles had stopped. "But that's preposterous," exclaimed Lady Bantry, speaking for them all. "Safety reasons? What possible safety reasons could there be?" Mrs. Larkin turned the paper over as if expecting to find some explanation on the reverse, then looked up at Mr. Dobson with a frown. "This bears your signature, Alfred. Surely you can tell us what this is about." Mr. Dobson's face had gone quite pale. He adjusted his spectacles and leaned forward to examine the document more closely. That is, yes. It does appear to bear my signature," he said slowly. "But I must confess, Mrs. Larkin, I have no recollection whatsoever of typing this notice." A murmur of confusion rippled through the room. Miss Marple, who had been listening with the particular attention she reserved for anything out of the ordinary, gently set down her knitting and regarded the paper with interest. "May I?" she asked quietly, extending her hand. Mrs. Larkin passed the document to her, and Miss Marple studied it carefully. The paper felt substantial under her fingers. Good quality, though not quite the same as the usual council correspondence she'd seen at various parish meetings. The red wax seal at the bottom was particularly impressive, bearing what appeared to be the council's official crest pressed into the crimson wax with considerable care. "Most unusual," she murmured half to herself. "The seal is quite elaborate, isn't it?" Before anyone could respond, the parish room door opened again, admitting Councillor Hubert Peabody in all his self-important glory. A man who had never encountered a bylaw he didn't love or a regulation he couldn't quote. Peabody possessed the unfortunate combination of genuine authority and limited imagination that made him both useful and insufferable in equal measure. Ladies," he boomed, removing his hat and smoothing his thinning hair, "I trust you've received the official notice. Most regrettable, of course, but rules are rules, and safety must always be our paramount concern." "But what safety concerns?" demanded Mrs. Larkin. "We've been meeting here for 3 years without incident." Peabody puffed out his chest. "These matters, my dear lady, are not really for— that is to say, the technical aspects of bylaw enforcement require a certain understanding of regulatory procedure that—" He was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who appeared in the doorway with his usual expression of patient martyrdom. "Afternoon, all," he said curtly. "Heard there was some sort of fuss about the knitting circle." "Inspector Slack," said Mrs. Larkin gratefully. "Perhaps you can shed some light on this situation. We've received this closure notice, but no one seems able to explain what safety concerns could possibly justify such drastic action." Slack glanced at the document with the weary resignation of a man who had seen too many bureaucratic tangles in his time. "Looks official enough, Tome," he said with a shrug. "If there's been an order issued under proper authority, then I'm afraid rules are rules. These old buildings can be tricky. Electrical problems, structural issues, best to err on the side of caution." The knitting circle began to disperse with reluctant murmurs of disappointment and confusion. As the ladies packed their wool and patterns into their bags, Miss Marple remained seated, still holding the notice. She had detected something that nagged at her. A faint, sweet scent rising from their wax seal. Cinnamon, she thought. How very interesting. As the room emptied, she held the paper up to the light from the window. The watermark was clearly visible. Waverly Bond, 1951. She had seen that particular mark before on the paper the Women's Institute used for their correspondence. How very interesting indeed. Chapter 2. Red Wax on Blue. The evening shadows were lengthening across St. Mary Me when Mr. Alfred Dobson made his fateful decision to return to the parish rooms. It was 20 minutes past 6, and the village was settling into its customary post-dinner quiet, with only the occasional bark of a dog or the distant clatter of crockery being cleared away to disturb the peace. Dobson had spent the intervening hours in a state of considerable agitation. The mysterious closure notice had troubled him deeply, not merely because he could not recall typing it, but because something about the entire business struck him as fundamentally wrong. As a man who prided himself on methodical record-keeping and proper procedure, the appearance of an official document bearing his signature, yet completely absent from his memory, was profoundly unsettling. After a solitary dinner of tinned soup and brown bread, consumed without his usual appreciation, he had made up his mind. Whatever the explanation for this curious situation, his duty was clear. He must inspect the parish rooms thoroughly and prepare a proper report for the council. If there were indeed safety concerns serious enough to warrant closure, then those concerns must be documented with appropriate diligence. "I shall examine the folding partition," he had announced to his empty sitting room, as was his habit when making important decisions, and the heating apparatus, most particularly the heating apparatus, given the troubles we've had with the boiler this winter. The parish room stood in darkness when he arrived, their windows reflecting the last pale gleam of twilight. Dobson let himself in through the main entrance, his keys jingling with authority in the quiet evening air. He switched on the overhead lights, which flickered reluctantly to life and cast their harsh illumination across the familiar space. The room felt different somehow in the evening quiet, larger perhaps and more echoing. The chairs where the knitting circle had sat that afternoon were still arranged in their sociable cluster, though the ladies' departure had left behind only the faintest trace of lavender water and the lingering warmth of feminine companionship. Dobson consulted his pocket watch, 7:00 exactly. He would allow himself precisely 1 hour to complete his inspection, after which he would return home to prepare his findings for tomorrow's council meeting. Order and punctuality in all things. That had been his motto throughout 30 years of public service. He began with the electrical fittings, testing each switch and examining the ancient wiring with the thoroughness of a man who understood that corners cut in maintenance often led to tragedy. The heating system came next. The radiators were all properly connected, though one showed signs of ammonore leak that would require attention before the following winter. It was when he turned his attention to the folding partition that disaster struck. The partition was indeed an elderly contrivance installed sometime in the 1920s, when the parish had first converted the old schoolroom into a community facility. It consisted of heavy wooden panels connected by metal hinges and suspended from an overhead track by a series of runners and pins. When deployed, it effectively divided the room in half. When folded back, it concealed itself neatly against the far wall. Dobson approached it with the systematic attention he brought to all mechanical problems. The lower portion appeared sound enough, though the panel showed the inevitable wear of decades of use. It was when he looked up at the overhead mechanism that he noticed something amiss. The upper right release pin, the one that secured the entire assembly when the partition was folded, appeared to be sitting rather loosely in its housing. He frowned and stood on his tiptoes to examine it more closely, mentally composing the language he would use in his report. At precisely 20 minutes past 7, just as the vicarage clock was chiming the quarter hour, there came a sudden sharp crack from somewhere overhead. Dobson had barely time to look up before the entire partition came crashing down upon him. The sound that followed was tremendous. Not merely the crash of the falling partition itself, but the splintering of wood, the screech of tortured metal, and underneath it all a sound that would haunt the memories of those who heard it. A single cut-off cry-off alarm. At the vicarage, where Dr. Haydock was enjoying a quiet evening with the Clements, the crash brought all three to their feet in alarm. "Good heavens!" exclaimed the Reverend Leonard Clement, setting down his teacup with such force that it rattled in its saucer. What on earth was that? Dr. Haydock, with the instincts born of long medical practice, was already reaching for his bag. "Sounded like it came from the direction of the parish rooms," he said grimly. "We'd better have a look." They found Dobson pinned beneath the fallen partition, his head at a unnatural angle, and his spectacles shattered on the linoleum floor. The overhead track hung broken where the release mechanism had given way, and one of the upper runners bore a dark smear that looked suspiciously like polish. Inspector Slack arrived within minutes of being summoned, his expression suggesting that he viewed this latest interruption to his evening as a personal affront. He surveyed the scene with the practiced eye of a man who had seen his share of domestic accidents, noting the position of the body, the angle of the fallen partition, and the scatter of debris across the floor. "Clumsy accident," he pronounced after a cursory examination. "These old mechanisms are a menace. I've been saying so for years. Pin worked loose. Whole thing came down on the poor fellow. Nothing anyone could have done." Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his examination more thorough than Slack's cursory inspection. "The blow appears to have been struck here," he said, indicating a depression above the right temple, consistent with being struck by a heavy, flexible surface. The impact would have been instantly fatal. "There you are, then," said Slack with satisfaction. "Open and shut case. Partition falls, man gets killed. Happens more often than you'd think with these old buildings." Miss Marple had arrived shortly after, the doctor, drawn by the commotion and the gathering crowd of concerned villagers. She stood quietly to one side, her mild blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene with the attention of a naturalist observing some particularly interesting specimen. It was she who first noticed the release pin itself, lying against the far skirting board where it had rolled after the collapse. She approached it carefully, mindful not to disturb any evidence that might prove significant, and bent to examine it closely without touching. "How curious," she murmured to herself, though loudly enough for Dr. Haydock to overhear. "What's that, Miss Marple?" he asked, looking up from his examination of the victim. "The pin," she replied thoughtfully. "There appears to be some sort of waxy substance on the eyelet. Quite fresh, I should think." Slack glanced over with barely concealed impatience. "Probably just grease from the mechanism. These old fittings need constant lubrication to keep them working." But Miss Marple continued to study the fallen pin with the intense concentration of someone who had learned, through long experience, that thesmoless details often prove to be the most significant. The waxy smear caught the harsh electric light, and she detected within it the same faint, sweet scent she had noticed earlier on the closure notice. Cinnamon again. Most interesting indeed. As the evening wore on and the necessary arrangements were made, the body removed, the scene secured, the preliminary statements taken, Miss Marple found herself thinking not about what had happened, but about what had not happened. In her experience, genuine accidents possessed a certain randomness, a quality of chaotic misfortune that distinguished them from events that had been carefully planned. This accident, she reflected as she made her way home through the quiet village streets, had altogether too much purpose about it for her complete comfort. Chapter 3. Miss Marple notices the wrong paper. The following morning dawned gray and drizzling, as if the weather itself was expressing disapproval of the previous evening's tragic events. Miss Marple rose early, as was her custom, and after attending to her morning prayers and a simple breakfast of toast and marmalade, she found herself drawn to her sitting-room window that overlooked the village street. The parish room stood silent and shuttered, with a constable stationed at the entrance to ensure that no unauthorized persons disturbed what Inspector Slack had deemed a straightforward accident scene. Yet something continued to trouble Miss Marple's orderly mind, a persistent sense that the pieces of this particular puzzle did not quite fit together as neatly as they should. It was shortly after 9 when Lady Bantry arrived at Daney Cottage, her usually immaculate appearance somewhat disheveled, and her customary composure clearly strained. "Jane, my dear," she said without preamble as Miss Marple welcomed her into the sitting-room, "I simply cannot get that dreadful business out of my mind. Poor Mr. Dobson, such a conscientious man, and to die in such a horrible way. But there's something about the whole affair that strikes me as decidedly odd." Miss Marple settled her old friend in the most comfortable chair and busied herself with preparing tea, a ritual that had always helped to clarify her thoughts during times of uncertainty. "I confess, Dolly, that I share your unease," she replied thoughtfully. "There are several aspects of yesterday's events that seem rather curious when one considers them carefully." Lady Bantry accepted her cup gratefully and leaned forward with the eager attention of someone who had found a sympathetic audience for her concerns. "That closure notice, for instance. I've been thinking about it all night, and I'm quite certain I've never seen the council use that particular style of paper before. The heading was wrong somehow. Too blue, too modern-looking." "How perceptive of you to notice," said Miss Marple approvingly. "I had much the same impression myself. In fact, I wonder if you might do me a small favor, Dolly. The vicarage keeps files of all the official correspondence from the council. Leonard is most meticulous about such things. Perhaps we might compare yesterday's notice with some previous examples." Within the hour, the two ladies found themselves seated in the vicarage study with the Reverend Clement's blessing and a collection of council documents spread before them on the mahogany desk. The contrast was immediately apparent and quite striking. Every genuine council notice in the file was printed on cream-colored rag paper of substantial weight, bearing a blind embossed crest at the top and sealed with a simple black ink stamp, never wax, and certainly never the elaborate red seal that had adorned the previous day's mysterious document. "You see," said Lady Bantry triumphantly, "completely different. And look here." She pulled out a notice dated from the previous autumn. "This is what their bylaw references look like. They always cite the full section and subsection, not just a simple letter designation." Miss Marple studied the documents with the methodical attention of a scholar comparing manuscripts. "Most illuminating indeed, and notice, my dear, how the typeface differs as well. These official notices all have that rather heavy, angular appearance that comes from the council's old Underwood machine, whereas yesterday's document showed quite a different character." She paused to examine the closure notice more closely, holding it up to the window to catch the morning light. The letter O in particular is quite distinctive. See how oval it appears, rather than the perfect circle one would expect from standard office equipment? "But surely," Lady Bantry protested, "Mr. Dobson would have noticed such discrepancies immediately. He was always so particular about proper form and procedure." "Indeed he was," Miss Marple agreed thoughtfully, which raises their uncomfortable question of why he did not identify the document as fraudulent when it was first presented to him, unless, of course, he did recognize its questionable nature and intended to investigate further. They turned their attention to the signature at the bottom of the notice, a careful reproduction of Dobson's familiar hand, yet somehow lacking the natural flow and confidence of genuine correspondence they had seen from him in the past. "The flourish is wrong," Miss Marple observed, tracing the air above the paper with one finger. Mr. Dobson always began his signature at the baseline and swept upward, but this one starts above the line and comes down. It suggests someone copying the appearance without understanding the natural movement of the pen. "You mean it was traced?" Lady Bantry asked, her voice dropping to a whisper, as if they were discussing state secrets. "Almost certainly, and rather clumsily, too. Probably through glass, which would account for the backward quality of the strokes. Someone had access to a genuine example of his signature, but lacked the skill to reproduce it convincingly." As they continued their examination, Miss Marple made another discovery that proved equally significant. The bylaw cited in the notice, 14B, established 1937, simply did not exist in the Council's official register. The closest match was Section 14, subsection 2, which dealt with entirely different matters and had been enacted in 1941, not 1937. "So, we've established," Miss Marple summarized as they prepared to leave the vicarage, "that the closure notice was typed on Women's Institute stationery, using what appears to be the Remington machine from the parish rooms, sealed with unauthorized red wax, signed with a traced copy of Mr. Dobson's signature, and citing a non-existent bylaw." "But who would go to such elaborate lengths?" Lady Bantry wondered aloud. "And why? What possible benefit could anyone derive from closing the knitting circle?" "That, my dear Dolly, is precisely what we must determine," Miss Marple replied with quiet determination. "But I suspect that once we understand the motive, the identity of our perpetrator will become considerably clearer." As they walked back through the village, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the sequence of events that had led to Mr. Dobson's death. The timing was particularly significant. The closure notice had been delivered just hours before Dobson's fatal inspection of the parish rooms. If someone had indeed fabricated the document, they would have known that a man of Dobson's meticulous nature would inevitably want to verify the stated safety concerns. "Dolly," she said suddenly, stopping in the middle of the village street, "I wonder if you recall exactly what Mr. Dobson said yesterday afternoon when he first saw the notice." Lady Bantry considered this carefully. "He seemed genuinely surprised, didn't he? Said he had no recollection of typing it despite the signature. And he did appear rather troubled by the whole business." "Precisely. Which suggests that he suspected something irregular from the very beginning." Miss Marple resumed walking, her mind working with increased clarity. "A man who discovers what he believes to be a forged official document would naturally want to investigate the matter privately before making any accusations. Hence his decision to inspect the parish rooms alone that evening." "You're suggesting that someone deliberately lured him there?" "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple replied carefully, "that someone may have anticipated exactly how a man of Mr. Dobson's character would respond to such a situation. The question that remains is whether they merely intended to prevent his investigation, or whether they planned something far more sinister from the very beginning." As they approached Daney Cottage, Miss Marple cast one final glance toward the silent parish rooms. Somewhere among the familiar faces and comfortable routines of village life, a mind had conceived and executed a plan of considerable cunning and ruthless determination. The challenge now was to identify that mind before it struck again. Chapter 4. The Partition That Fell. Morning after their revelatory examination of the council documents, Miss Marple found herself with an unexpected visitor. Lottie Briggs stood on her doorstep, clutching a worn shopping basket and wearing an expression of considerable distress. "Begging your pardon, Miss Marple," she began hesitantly, "but I wondered if I might have a word about what happened to poor Mr. Dobson. I mean, there's something that's been troubling me, something dreadful, and I don't rightly know what to make of it." Miss Marple welcomed her in with genuine warmth, recognizing in the caretaker's manner the particular anxiety that comes when practical people encounter circumstances that defy their understanding of how the world should work. "Please do sit down, Mrs. Briggs," she said gently, guiding her guest to the small sofa by the fireplace. "You look as though you've had rather a difficult night." Lottie perched on the edge of the cushion, her weathered hands twisting the handle of her basket. "That's just it, Miss Marple. I keep going over and over it in my mind, and I can't make sense of what happened. You see, I was the last one to use that partition before the accident." She paused, gathering her thoughts with the careful precision of someone unaccustomed to being the center of attention. It was Wednesday evening after the Mothers' Union meeting. Mrs. Hartwell always likes the room divided for her talks about missionary work. Says it makes things more intimate. When they finished, I folded the partition back proper, the way I always do. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "And you're quite certain about the mechanism being secure?" "Absolutely certain," Lottie replied with emphasis. "I've been looking after those rooms for nigh on 15 years, Miss Marple. I know every creak and groan of that old building. The partition's tricky, mind you. The pins need to be seated just so, or the whole thing won't hold. But I checked both upper pins myself, gave them each a little twist to make sure they were properly latched." She stood up suddenly, as if physical movement might help her explain more clearly. "The thing is, when I found poor Mr. Dobson yesterday morning, well, the constable let me have a quick look before they sealed everything up. That upper right pin was lying clear across by the skirting board. Now, if it had just worked loose, gradual-like, it would have dropped straight down, wouldn't it? But there it was, thrown right across the room." Miss Marple considered this information with the serious attention it deserved. In her experience, when practical people like Lottie Briggs expressed concern about mechanical matters within their expertise, those concerns were invariably well-founded. "You mentioned both upper pins. What became of the left-hand one?" "Still in place it was. Thought the whole assembly had twisted something awful when the right side gave way. But there's what's really puzzling me, Miss Marple. When I went back this morning to collect my cleaning things from the cupboard, I noticed something I'd missed in all the confusion yesterday." Lottie reached into her basket and withdrew a knitting needle of the common household variety, steel, with a slight bend near the point that spoke of long use and occasional mishandling. "Found this caught under the edge of the stage skirting," she continued. "Size 9 it is, and there's something queer about it. Look here." She held the needle up to the light, indicating a small section near the point. "There's a sort of greasy smear on it, and if you look real close, you can see it's been rubbed against something metal, left a tiny burr." "It has." Miss Marple examined the needle with the same careful attention she had given to the forged closure notice. The greasy substance had a familiar consistency, and when she held it close, she detected a faint but unmistakable scent. "Most interesting," she murmured. "Mrs. Briggs, you mentioned that the pins require careful seating to hold the partition secure. I wonder, might it be possible for someone to position a pin so that it appeared to be properly latched but was actually held in place by some other means?" Lottie frowned, considering this possibility, with the thoroughness of someone who understood mechanical principles through long practical experience. "Well, I suppose if you had something thin enough to wedge in the housing, something that would hold the pin just barely in place but might give way under pressure. Yes, it might be possible, but it would be a chancy business. You'd never know exactly when it might fail." "Unless," Miss Marple suggested gently, "one had some means of ensuring that the failure occurred at a specific moment." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who appeared at the cottage door in response to Miss Marple's earlier telephone invitation. She had hoped that his medical knowledge might provide additional insight into the circumstances of Dobson's death. After Lottie had repeated her account for the doctor's benefit, he listened with the focused attention of someone accustomed to extracting significant details from seemingly ordinary observations. The position of the pin is indeed suggestive, he agreed. A simple mechanical failure would be unlikely to propel it such a distance. And the fact that you found this knitting needle in proximity to the accident site raises additional questions. He examined the needle carefully, noting the greasy residue and the telltale scratches that indicated contact with metal under pressure. This appears to have been used as some sort of lever or prop, he concluded. The burr you mentioned is consistent with metal-on-metal contact, and the grease suggests it may have been used to facilitate movement. Miss Marple rose and moved to the window, gazing out at the parish rooms with an expression of deep concentration. "Mrs. Briggs," she said eventually, "I wonder if you might show us exactly how the partition mechanism operates. Not in the rooms themselves, of course. I understand they remain sealed, but perhaps you could demonstrate the principle." Lottie looked puzzled but willing. "I suppose I could, though I'm not sure how much help it would be without the actual machinery." "Sometimes," Miss Marple replied with a slight smile. "Understanding how something is supposed to work can be quite as illuminating as discovering how it actually failed." As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the peculiar sequence of events that addled to this tragedy. The forged closure notice delivered at precisely the right moment to ensure Dobson's presence in the parish rooms. The partition pin apparently held in place by an improvised wedge that would fail under specific circumstances. The knitting needle found in a location that suggested deliberate placement rather than accidental loss. Each element considered alone might be explained by coincidence or misfortune, but taken together they painted a picture of careful planning and ruthless execution that chilled her to the bone. Someone in St. Mary Me had committed murder, and they had done so with a cunning that spoke of intimate knowledge of both the victim's character and the mechanical peculiarities of the parish rooms. The challenge now was to identify that someone before they had opportunity to cover their tracks more thoroughly. As they walked toward the village center, Miss Marple reflected that in her long experience of human nature, the most dangerous criminals were often those who hid their malice behind facades of respectability and community spirit. The question was, which pillar of village society had blood on their hands? Chapter 5. Blue Pencil in the Margin. The afternoon had turned unexpectedly warm for late March, with the first tentative signs of spring emerging in the cottage gardens that lined the village streets. Miss Marple, accompanied by Lady Bantry and Dr. Haydock, made her way toward the high street with the measured pace of someone who understood that patience often yielded better results than haste. Their first destination was the small office above Raj and Son Haberdashery, where Councillor Peabody maintained his unofficial headquarters for what he grandly termed his civic responsibilities. The shop itself occupied the ground floor of a timber-framed building that had witnessed 3 centuries of commercial enterprise. Its bow windows displayed an assortment of ribbons, buttons, and domestic notions arranged with more enthusiasm than artistic sensibility. They found Councillor Peabody in his element, seated behind a desk laden with official documents, and wearing the expression of a man who took considerable pleasure in the exercise of authority, however limited. His pocket ledger, a battered volume bound in cracked leather, lay open before him, its pages covered with the meticulous annotations that he believed demonstrated his indispensable value to the community. "Miss Marple, Lady Bantry, Dr. Haydock," he boomed, rising with the dignity befitting his position. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure? Not, I trust, any further complications regarding the unfortunate business at the parish rooms?" Miss Marple settled herself in the chair he offered, her mild manner concealing the sharp attention with which she observed every detail of his office arrangements. "Actually, Counselor, we were hoping you might clarify a small point regarding the bylaws cited in yesterday's closure notice. We've been examining the council records, and there seems to be some confusion about the specific regulation that was invoked." Peabody's chest swelled with importance at this recognition of his expertise. Ah, yes. Bylaw 14, regarding temporary closures for safety purposes. Quite proper procedure, I assure you. Though I confess the circumstances were most regrettable. I wonder, Miss Marple continued with gentle persistence, if we might have a look at your personal reference materials. We're having some difficulty locating the exact text of that particular regulation. With evident pride, Peabody turned his ledger around for their inspection. Thebby law listings were recorded in his characteristic cramped handwriting, each entry numbered with mathematical precision. But as Miss Marple studied the page more closely, something caught their attention that made her pulse quicken. There, inserted between the existing entries in a slightly different shade of blue, was a line reading 14B temporary closures, added in what appeared to be copying pencil rather than the black ink used for the other entries. Moreover, the addition showed clear signs of having been partially erased and rewritten, leaving telltale smudges in the margin. "How thorough you are in your record-keeping," she observed admiringly. "I notice you've made some recent additions to your reference list." Peabody glanced down at the ledger with a slight frown, as if seeing the blue notation for the first time. Yes. One must keep current with regulatory developments, of course, though I must confess, I don't recall making that particular addition myself. Lady Bantry, following Miss Marple's lead, leaned forward to examine the page more closely. "Such a distinctive shade of blue pencil," she remarked innocently. "Not the sort one usually finds in ordinary stationery supplies?" "Copying pencil, actually," Peabody replied, his voice carrying a note of uncertainty that had not been there moments before. "Council offices use it for duplicate records, though I can't imagine how. That is, I normally use black ink for my personal notations." Dr. Haydock, meanwhile, had been studying not the ledger, but Peabody's face, applying the diagnostic skills that had served him well throughout his medical career. "You seem rather puzzled by this entry, Counselor. Are you quite certain you don't remember adding it?" "Well, one makes so many notations in the course of official duties," Peabody blustered, his earlier confidence visibly diminishing. "Perhaps, that is, it's possible someone else may have, but that seems most irregular." Miss Marple closed the ledger gently and returned it to its position on the desk. Most irregular indeed, particularly since the bylaw in question appears not to exist in the official council register. The color drained from Peabody's face as the implications of this statement became clear. "Not exist? But surely, if it's in my reference book." "References can be altered," Miss Marple observed quietly, "just as official documents can be forged. The question is whether such alterations are made by the book's owner or by someone else with access to it." As they prepared to leave Peabody's office, Miss Marple made one final observation that would prove significant. On the desk beside Theliger lay a small collection of official documents awaiting filing, and among them she noticed a memorandum regarding parish room bookings that bore fresh pencil annotations in the same distinctive blue shade. Their next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Pike presided over the morning mail, sorting with her usual combination of efficiency and barely concealed curiosity about the affairs of her neighbors. The events of the past 2 days had clearly provided her with conversational material that would sustain the village gossip network for weeks to come. "Such a terrible business about poor Mr. Dobson," she began immediately upon their arrival. "Though I must say I wasn't entirely surprised to hear about problems with those old parish room fittings. Only last week, Mr. Rudge was in here making quite a fuss about safety standards." Miss Marple's ears pricked at this information. "Mr. Rudge from the haberdashery?" "The very same. Came in Tuesday afternoon. It was wanting to know about postal procedures for official documents. Seemed quite interested in sealing requirements, asked specifically about red wax, and whether it was still considered proper for formal correspondence. Lady Bantry exchanged a meaningful glance with Miss Marple. How unusual for a shopkeeper to be concerned with such matters. That's what I thought, Mrs. Pike continued, warming to her subject. But he explained that he was planning some sort of window display about traditional crafts and wanted everything to be authentic. Bought quite a lot of supplies, actually. New carbon ribbon for his typewriter, several sticks of sealing wax in different colors, and that special copying pencil the council uses for duplicate records. A copying pencil? Miss Marple inquired with carefully controlled interest. Blue one? Yes. Said he needed it for some sort of demonstration about proper record-keeping. Though between you and me, Mrs. Pike lowered her voice conspiratorially, I thought it odd that he waited until after closing time to post his letter. Came round to the back door Tuesday night, he did, with a large envelope that he said had to catch the evening collection. As they walked back through the village center, Miss Marple found herself constructing a timeline of events that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The purchase of sealing materials and copying pencil on Tuesday, followed by the mysterious after-hours posting of a large envelope, the forged closure notice delivered Wednesday afternoon, and finally Dobson's fatal accident Wednesday evening. It's beginning to form a pattern, she murmured to her companions. Though Westall lacked the most crucial element, the motive that would drive someone to commit such an elaborate and ruthless crime. Dr. Haydock nodded grimly. The technical aspects are becoming clearer, certainly. But you're quite right about the motive. Why would anyone go to such lengths to close the knitting circle? And why resort to murder to prevent discovery? Perhaps, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, the knitting circle itself was never the real target. Perhaps it was merely a convenient means to an end, a way of getting Mr. Dobson alone in the parish rooms at a predictable time. As they approached the village green, where the ancient oak cast its familiar shadow across the weathered benches, Miss Marple reflected on the peculiar nature of this crime. Like many of the most dangerous deceptions, it had been hidden beneath a veneer of civic responsibility and community concern. But as her dear nephew Raymond had once observed, the most convincing lies were always those that contained just enough truth to make them plausible. Chapter 6. The Seal from a Candle Spoon. Evening light was beginning to fade when Miss Marple found herself once again examining the forged closure notice, this time with the aid of a magnifying glass borrowed from Dr. Haydock's medical bag. Lady Bantry sat beside her in the cottage sitting room, maintaining the sort of companionable silence that comes from years-off friendship, and shared curiosity about the darker aspects of human nature. The red wax seal had seemed impressive enough at first glance, a credible reproduction of the council's official crest pressed into crimson wax with apparent authority. But under magnification, subtle imperfections became visible that told a different story entirely. How very interesting, Miss Marple murmured, adjusting the angle of her examination. Dolly, do you see these faint markings beneath the main impression? They appear to be letters, though reversed and partially obscured. Lady Bantry leaned closer, squinting through her own spectacles. I can just make out what might be an R, and is that an S beside it? Indeed it is, and both letters appear backwards, as one would expect if the seal had been pressed over an existing stamp impression. Miss Marple set down the magnifying glass with satisfaction. Someone has attempted to create an official seal by pressing wax over their own business stamp, hoping that the council crest would obscure the original markings. She rose and moved to the window, holding the document up to catch the last rays of daylight. There's something else rather curious about this wax. Most sealing wax has a rather neutral odor when fresh, but this specimen retains a distinctly sweet fragrance even after 24 hours. Cinnamon, Lady Bantry observed, following her friend's example. Rather like those decorative candles one sees in shop windows during the Christmas season. Exactly so. And I believe we may safely conclude that this particular wax was not purchased from official council suppliers. Miss Marple returned to her chair with the measured movements of someone whose mind was working rapidly through a complex chain of reasoning. The question now becomes who in our village would have both the means to acquire such specialized materials and the skill to create a convincing forgery. Their speculation was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Through the cottage window, they observed Inspector Slack approaching the front door with his characteristic expression of resigned duty. Miss Marple welcomed him with genuine pleasure, recognizing in his visit an opportunity to share her growing concerns about the circumstances surrounding Dobson's death. "Evening, Miss Marple," Slack began without preamble as he settled himself in the offered chair. "Thought you'd want to know that we've concluded our examination of the parish rooms." Straightforward accident, just as I suspected from the beginning. Partition mechanism failed. Poor fellow was in the wrong place at the wrong time. "How very efficient of you, Inspector," Miss Marple replied mildly. "I wonder if your investigation included an examination of the sealing materials used for official council correspondence." Slack's eyebrows rose in surprise. Sealing materials? What possible bearing could that have on a mechanical accident? Rather than answer directly, Miss Marple produced the closure notice and invited the inspector to examine it closely. She guided his attention to the reversed lettering visible beneath the wax and encouraged him to detect the distinctive cinnamon fragrance that clung to the red seal. "Most peculiar," Slack admitted after several minutes of careful study, "though I'm not sure I follow the significance of these observations." The significance, Inspector, lies in the possibility that this closure notice may not be the genuine article it purports to be. Miss Marple's voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had learned to present uncomfortable truths with diplomatic tact. If that proves to be the case, then Mr. Dobson's presence in the parish rooms last evening was not the result of routine maintenance duties, but rather an attempt to investigate what he suspected might be fraudulent documentation. She proceeded to outline the evidence they had gathered: the wrong paper stock, the non-existent bylaw citation, the traced signature, and now the improperly created seal with its telltale reverse lettering and unusual fragrance. Slack listened with growing attention, his professional instincts gradually overcoming his initial skepticism. "You're suggesting that someone deliberately lured Dobson to the parish rooms by means of this forged notice?" "I'm suggesting that someone with considerable knowledge of both Mr. Dobson's character and the mechanical peculiarities of the parish rooms may have done precisely that," Miss Marple confirmed, "and furthermore, that they may have arranged for the partition to fail at a moment when it would prove fatal to anyone standing beneath it." The inspector's expression had grown distinctly grim during this recital. "That would constitute premeditated murder, Miss Marple." "A very serious allegation indeed." "Indeed it would. Which is why I thought it best to share these observations with you before pursuing the matter any further." After Slack had departed with the promise to reopen his investigation, Miss Marple and Lady Bantry found themselves alone with their thoughts and the growing certainty that they were dealing with a crime of unusual cunning and deliberate malice. "Jane," Lady Bantry said eventually, "if your theory is correct, then we're looking for someone who had access to the parish rooms, knowledge of the partition mechanism, skill in forgery, and possession of the specific materials used to create that seal." "Quite so. And we must also consider the question of motive. Why would anyone wish to harm Mr. Dobson specifically? He was a harmless man whose greatest fault was an excessive devotion to proper procedure." Lady Bantry was quiet for a moment, then spoke with sudden insight. "Perhaps that's exactly why he was targeted. If someone was planning some sort of deception involving official documents or council business, Mr. Dobson would be precisely the sort of person who might detect and expose the fraud. Miss Marple nodded approvingly at this reasoning. An astute observation, my dear. Which brings us back to the question of who in our community would undertake such elaborate preparations for what appears to be a relatively minor deception. A thief summoned by their discussion, the answer began to present itself through their continued examination of the physical evidence. Miss Marple had been studying the closure notice under different lighting conditions when she made a discovery that caused her to catch her breath sharply. "Dolly, look at this," she said urgently, holding the document at a particular angle to the lamplight. "Do you see how the wax has been applied? There are small ridges and imperfections that suggest it was not poured directly from a stick, but rather melted in some sort of small container." Lady Bantry examined the seal with renewed attention. Rather like it had been melted in a spoon, perhaps? Precisely like that. And noticed this tiny fleck of red caught in the paper fibers near the edge of the seal. It appears to be a grain of unmelted wax that was incorporated into the mixture. The implications of this discovery were becoming clearer by the moment. Someone had melted decorative sealing wax, the cinnamon-scented variety sold for craft purposes rather than official use, in a small implement such as a candle spoon, then pressed it over their own business stamp to create the illusion of an official seal. The question now, Miss Marple observed with quiet satisfaction, is where we might find evidence of such an improvised sealing operation. Wax leaves traces that are difficult to remove completely, and the distinctive fragrance would linger in any enclosed space where such work had been conducted. As the evening deepened around them, both ladies found themselves contemplating the uncomfortable reality that somewhere in their peaceful village, a mind capable of elaborate deception and ruthless murder had been at work. The challenge was to identify that mind before it had opportunity to cover its tracks more thoroughly. Chapter 7. Mercer's Twine with a Red Fleck. The A. Following morning brought with it one of those crisp, clear days that make English villages appear at their most picturesque, with daffodils nodding in cottage gardens and the promise of genuine spring warmth in the air. Miss Marple had risen early, as was her custom, but instead of attending to her usual domestic routine, she found herself drawn once again to the parish rooms. Inspector Slack had been as good as his word regarding the reopening of his investigation, and the building was no longer sealed. However, the constable remained on duty, a young man named Wiggins, whose respect for Miss Marple's reputation had been enhanced by his superior's grudging acknowledgement of her observational skills. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully as she approached. "Inspector said you might be wanting another look at the scene. Said to give you every assistance, though I'm not sure what more there is to see." Miss Marple smiled at his earnest manner. "Thank you, Constable. I wonder if I might examine the area behind the notice board. There are some small details that may have been overlooked in the initial confusion." The notice board in question was a substantial affair mounted on the wall adjacent to the folding partition, its corked surface covered with the usual collection of parish announcements, church notices, and community advertisements. It was the sort of fixture that becomes so familiar in daily use that it renders itself practically invisible. Working with methodical precision, Miss Marple began to examine the narrow space between the board and the wall, using a knitting needle of her own to probe gently into the accumulated dust and debris of years. Her patience was rewarded when the needle encountered something that felt distinctly different from the expected collection of dropped pins and forgotten scraps. "How interesting," she murmured, carefully extracting a length of fine cord that had been compressed into the corner where the board met the skirting. The string was perhaps 18 inches in length, with a distinctly professional quality that suggested commercial rather than domestic origin. Constable Wiggins leaned closer to examine her discovery. "Looks like packaging twine, doesn't it? The sort shops use for parcels." "Indeed it does," Miss Marple agreed, holding the cord up to the light streaming through the parish room windows. "And notice, if you please, This red tracer thread woven through the natural fiber. That's a quality mark used by suppliers to identify their particular grade of merchandise. As she continued her examination, additional details emerged that proved equally significant. One end of the twine showed a smooth, polished appearance, as if it had been drawn repeatedly across a wooden surface under tension. The opposite end bore the clean, precise cut of sharp scissors, rather than the frayed appearance of cord that had broken under stress. "Someone used this deliberately," she observed thoughtfully. "The polished section suggests it was run over wood, perhaps a rail or molding, while the cut end indicates it was severed intentionally when its purpose was complete." Her attention was drawn next to the stage area, where a small raised platform provided space for speakers during parish meetings. The edge of this platform was trimmed with a simple wooden rail, and Miss Marple discovered upon close inspection that one section bore faint scratches consistent with rope or cord having been drawn across it repeatedly. More intriguing still was a small metal eye screw set into the floor near the platform's base, the sort of fitting used to secure temporary cables or guide ropes during events. The screw showed signs of recent use with tiny fibers caught in its threads, and a faint smear of what appeared to be paraffin oil around its base. "Constable Wiggins," she said carefully, "I wonder if you might help me understand the normal arrangements for this room. Are these eye screws regularly used for any particular purpose?" The young officer examined the fitting with professional interest. "Can't say I've ever noticed them being used, Miss Marple, though I suppose they might be handy for stringing decorations or securing equipment for special events." Miss Marple nodded absently, her mind already working through the implications of these discoveries. A length of commercial twine with identifying marks, showing evidence of deliberate use and careful removal. Scratches on the platform rail suggesting repeated passage of cord under tension. A floor fitting with traces of lubricant and caught fibers. The picture that emerged was of someone who had prepared the parish rooms very carefully indeed, installing what could only be described as a triggering mechanism of considerable sophistication. Her examination of the area near the partition itself yielded the final piece of this particular puzzle. Caught in the upper runner, the metal track, along which the partition panel slid when being opened or closed, was a single red fiber that proved under careful inspection to match exactly the tracer thread from the twine she had discovered. But there was something else as well. Wedged into a joint in the runner mechanism was a small cardboard cylinder, no larger than a thimble, that bore the printed legend of a well-known haberdashery supplier. It was exactly the sort of inner spool used to wind balls of knitting wool, and its presence in such a location could hardly be accidental. "Most illuminating," Miss Marple murmured, carefully extracting this final clue. "Someone has been remarkably thorough in their preparations, but equally careless about removing all evidence of their work." As she prepared to leave the parish rooms, Miss Marple found herself constructing a mental picture of how the murder had been accomplished. The partition pin held barely in place by some improvised wedge. A length of twine running from the pin's housing over the platform rail behind the notice board, and presumably to some point outside the building where it could be operated remotely. The killer had needed only to wait until their victim was positioned beneath the partition, then apply tension to the cord. The wedge would slip, the pin would fall, and the massive partition would crush anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in its path. It was a method that displayed both mechanical ingenuity and callous disregard for human life. The work of someone who combined technical skill with moral emptiness in particularly dangerous proportions. As she walked back through the village center, Miss Marple reflected that she had seen enough evidence to understand how the crime had been committed. The question that remained was identifying which member of their small community possessed both the necessary knowledge and the motive for such an elaborate act of murder. But even as she pondered this question, she suspected that the distinctive red flecked twine would prove to be the key that unlocked the final mystery. Chapter 8. The Draft Under the Dormice. Marple's next port of call was Lottie Briggs's modest cottage on Vicarage Lane, where she found the caretaker engaged in the weekly ritual of blacking her front step, with the concentrated attention that she brought to all domestic tasks. The morning sun caught the freshly polished surface, creating a mirror-like finish that spoke of long practice and considerable pride. "Good morning, Mrs. Briggs," Miss Marple called cheerfully as she approached the garden gate. "I hope you don't mind my disturbing you again, but there are one or two small matters about Wednesday evening that I hoped you might clarify." Lottie straightened from her work with visible relief at the interruption. "Not at all, Miss Marple. Truth to tell, I've been going over that night in my mind something dreadful, wondering if there was anything I might have done different." "Come in, won't you? The kettle's just boiled." They settled themselves in Lottie's spotless kitchen, where every surface gleamed with a sort of cleanliness that comes from daily attention rather than occasional effort. Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea gratefully, noting with interest the collection of cleaning supplies arranged with military precision on the shelves. "I've been wondering about the sequence of events that evening," Miss Marple began carefully. "You mentioned that you opened the side door of the parish rooms at 7 to check on things before going home. I wonder if you recall anything unusual about that particular moment?" Lottie frowned with concentration, clearly determined to provide the most accurate account possible. "Now that you mention it, there was something odd. When I turned the key and pulled the door open, it stuck something awful in damp weather. I felt a sort of tug, like there was resistance, almost as if someone was pulling against me from the other side." Miss Marple leaned forward with increased interest. "A pulling sensation? How very curious. And this occurred immediately upon opening the door?" "That's right. Just for a moment, mind you, like something was caught under the door that suddenly came free. I thought perhaps it was just the draft, but looking back it seemed more deliberate somehow." "Did you notice anything on the ground outside the door? Any marks or disturbances that might explain the sensation?" Lottie's expression brightened with recognition. "Funny you should ask that, Miss Marple. When I went back this morning to collect my cleaning things from the cupboard, I had a proper look around outside. There's a clear mark across the threshold, a sort of polished line where something's been drawn back and forth repeatedly." She paused, gathering her thoughts with characteristic precision. "And underneath the mat, the one we keep there to wipe feet, I found the strangest thing. 2 little grooves in the dust running parallel, like railway tracks, but no wider than string. Fresh made they were, not old marks." Miss Marple absorbed this information with the satisfaction of someone whose theories were being confirmed by practical evidence. The picture was becoming increasingly clear. Someone had indeed used the side door as part of their murderous mechanism, drawing a cord from inside the building to a position outside where they could apply the fatal tension. "Mrs. Briggs," she continued, "you mentioned that you use a particular type of polish for cleaning the parish rooms. I wonder if you might show me your supplies." Lottie led her to a cupboard where various cleaning materials were stored with exemplary organization. Among them was a tin of black polish that Miss Marple recognized as standard paraffin-based shoe blacking, the sort used throughout England for maintaining leather goods and painted surfaces. "May I?" Miss Marple asked, and upon receiving permission, she opened the tin to examine its contents. The polish had a characteristic sharp odor that spoke of mineral spirits and lampblack, quite different from the sweeter, more complex fragrance she had detected in other locations. "You're very methodical about your cleaning routine," she observed approvingly. "I imagine you would notice immediately if anyone else had been using your materials or working in areas under your care." "Indeed I would," Lottie replied with some asperity. "I've been maintaining those rooms for 15 years, Miss Marple, and I know every inch of them. Any interference with my arrangements would stand out like a sore thumb." As they prepared to leave the cottage, Miss Marple made one final observation that would prove significant. Near the kitchen window, she noticed a small collection of items that Lottie had apparently retrieved from the parish rooms during her morning visit. A dust pan, several cleaning cloths, and a small bottle of what appeared to be specialized polish. "I don't recognize that particular preparation," Miss Marple commented, indicating the bottle. Lottie glanced at it with evident puzzlement. "Neither do I, to tell the truth. Found it on the stage steps when I was cleaning up this morning. Not one of mine. I use paraffin-based products exclusively. This smells quite different. Sort of spicy and sweet at the same time." With Lottie's permission, Miss Marple examined the mysterious polish more closely. It had indeed a distinctive fragrance that combined the sharp bite of turpentine with something warmer and more aromatic. Cloves, perhaps, or another cooking spice. The consistency was different, too, more liquid than the heavy paste that Lottie preferred for her regular maintenance work. "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured, making a mental note to pursue this discovery further. "And you found this on the stage steps?" "Right where someone would stand if they were adjusting the stage lighting or reaching up to the overhead fittings. Fresh spilled. It was still slightly tacky to the touch." As Miss Marple made her way back through the village center, she found herself piecing together the final elements of what had clearly been a carefully orchestrated crime. The cord drawn under the door, the polished threshold where it had been repeatedly tested, the distinctive polish that differed from Lottie's usual supplies, all pointed to someone who had spent considerable time preparing the parish rooms for their deadly purpose. Moreover, the discovery of the foreign polish suggested that the killer had left traces of their presence that extended beyond the mechanical aspects of the murder itself. The sweet, spicy fragrance was distinctive enough to identify its source once she knew where to look. The question now was, which member of their community used such specialized materials in their daily work, and whether that same person had reason to wish Alfred Dobson dead. As she approached the high street, Miss Marple reflected that in her long experience of criminal behavior, the most dangerous perpetrators were often those who combined meticulous planning with fatal overconfidence in their own cleverness. This particular killer had been extremely thorough in preparing their mechanism, but rather less careful about concealing the evidence of their presence at the scene. It was a mistake that would prove to be their undoing. Chapter 9. The Ledger with Two Entries, Year T. Afternoon shadows were lengthening across the high street when Miss Marple made her way to the modest office that served as the administrative heart of St. Mary Me's parish business. Mr. Dobson's desk remained exactly as he'd left it on that fateful Wednesday evening, its surface arranged with the mathematical precision that had characterized every aspect of his professional life. Inspector Slack had granted her permission to examine Dobson's records, recognizing with characteristic reluctance that her observations had proven more valuable than his initial investigation. The office itself bore the unmistakable stamp of a man who believed that proper documentation was the foundation of civilized society. Filing cabinets labeled with meticulous care, correspondence sorted by date and importance, and account books that would have satisfied the most demanding auditor. Miss Marple settled herself in the chair that Dobson had occupied for nearly 3 decades, allowing her eyes to adjust to the particular quality of light that filtered through the narrow windows. Sometimes she had learned understanding a man's working habits could provide insights that mere examination of documents could not. The desk drawers revealed their contents with the orderly precision she had expected. Pens arranged by type and function, stamps and sealing materials stored in separate compartments, carbon paper and duplicate forms organized for maximum efficiency. But it was in the bottom drawer, tucked beneath a collection of official forms, that she made her first significant discovery. A manila folder bore the notation, "Parish Room Bookings, current in Dobson's characteristic copperplate hand." Within it, Miss Marple found a collection of receipts and booking forms that, told a story far more complex than she had initially anticipated. The first document to catch her attention was a receipt dated for the previous Wednesday, the very day of Dobson's death. It bore the heading Parish Room Hire, Rudge and Son Demonstration and was signed in Dobson's careful signature. But immediately beneath it lay another receipt for the same date, this one reading Women's Institute Knitting Circle, regular booking. 2 separate rentals for the same evening in the same building at overlapping times. Miss Marple studied the documents with growing fascination. The booking for Rudge and Son was dated Tuesday afternoon, exactly 24 hours before the knitting circle had received their closure notice. The purpose was listed as educational demonstration of traditional crafts and domestic economy. Language sufficiently vague to cover almost any activity while sounding appropriately civic-minded. More intriguing still was the discovery of a third document, this one apparently prepared but never completed. It was a draft letter addressed to the Women's Institute proposing the rental of alternative premises for their weekly meetings at a rate nearly double what they currently paid for the parish rooms. The letterhead was that of Rudge and Son Haberdashery, and the proposed venue was described as our newly renovated back room, suitable for small gatherings and fully equipped for domestic crafts instruction. Miss Marple set the documents aside and turned her attention to Dobson's personal diary, a leather-bound volume that recorded not only his official appointments, but also his private observations about parish business. The entries for the days leading up to his death made particularly illuminating reading. Monday, 21st March, query from B. Rudge, parish room booking procedures. Seemed unusually interested in closure protocols and emergency regulations. Must check files. Tuesday, 22nd March, Rudge and Son booking confirmed for Wednesday evening. Purpose somewhat unclear despite lengthy explanation. Note to verify educational credentials if demonstration proceeds. Wednesday, 23rd March, closure order received. Most irregular format. Must inspect premises personally before council meeting Thursday. Check electrical fittings and partition mechanism. The final entry was written in pencil rather than Dobson's usual ink, suggesting it had been added hastily. Red wax on closure notice, not standard council procedure. Query order form authenticity. Tucked inside the diary at this page was a small scrap of paper that bore the unmistakable traces of red sealing wax. Dobson had apparently scraped some of the wax from the closure notice for comparison purposes, and the sample retained that distinctive cinnamon fragrance that Miss Marple had noted from the beginning. But perhaps most significant of all was a marginal notation on the Rudge and Son booking form itself. In Dobson's precise hand were the words, educational demonstration, verify credentials, check council authorization for commercial activities in parish premises. It was clear that the parish clerk had been deeply suspicious of Basil's motives from the very beginning. The booking had been accepted, but only with reservations that would certainly have led to further investigation had Dobson lived to pursue them. Miss Marple leaned back in the chair and contemplated the picture that was emerging from these documents. Rudge and Son had been planning something far more elaborate than a simple educational demonstration. The rental of the parish rooms, the preparation of alternative premises for displaced tenants, the forged closure notice designed to remove the regular occupants all pointed to a commercial scheme of considerable ambition, but what had begun as mere fraud had escalated to murder when Dobson's suspicious nature threatened to expose the deception before it could be completed. As she prepared to leave the office, Miss Marple made one final discovery that confirmed her growing certainty about the identity of Dobson's killer. Behind the desk, she found a wastepaper basket that had apparently escaped the attention of Inspector Slack's initial search. Among the usual debris of office life was a ball band from a skein of knitting wool, the sort of paper wrapper that manufacturers used to identify their products and provide knitting instructions. But this particular band was unusual in that the inner cardboard core was missing, leaving only the outer paper sleeve. The brand name was clearly visible: Rudge and Son Finest Quality Double Knitting Wool, and the color was described as cherry red, shade 247. Miss Marple smiled with quiet satisfaction as she carefully preserved this final piece of evidence. She had seen enough cherry red wool fibers caught in the partition mechanism to understand exactly how this particular ball band had lost its inner core. The cardboard center had been removed to create a small spool around which the murderer could wind their triggering cord, keeping it tangle-free and ready for use when the fatal moment arrived. It was precisely the sort of improvised tool that would occur to someone whose daily work involved the handling of yarn and thread, someone like a haberdasher who understood the practical applications of such materials. As she walked back through the village center in the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected that she now understood not only how Alfred Dobson had been murdered, but why his death had been necessary from the killer's perspective. The question that remained was whether she could prove her theory before Basil Rudge had opportunity to destroy the remaining evidence of his crimes. Chapter 10. Parish Rooms, Pins, Partitions, and a Pattern. The parish rooms had never witnessed such a gathering as assembled there on Thursday evening, 3 days after Alfred Dobson's tragic death. Inspector Slack stood near the folding partition with the grave expression of a man who had been compelled to revise his professional opinions, while the principal figures of St. Mary Me's community occupied chairs arranged in a semicircle facing the scene of the crime. Miss Marple had requested this reconstruction with characteristic diffidence, suggesting that perhaps a demonstration of her theory might prove useful to the official investigation. Lady Bantry sat beside her, maintaining the supportive presence of true friendship, while Dr. Haydock positioned himself where he might observe both the proceedings and the reactions of those present. Mrs. Larkin was there, of course, as convener of the displaced knitting circle, and beside her sat Lottie Briggs, whose intimate knowledge of the building's peculiarities had proved so valuable. Counselor Peabody occupied a prominent position, his notebook at the ready for what he clearly expected to be a vindication of proper administrative procedures. And finally, near the back of the assembled group, Basil Rudge sat with the careful composure of a man who believed his cleverness had proven superior to official investigation. His smooth features betrayed nothing more than civic-minded concern for the resolution of this unfortunate matter. "Ladies and gentlemen," Miss Marple began in her gentle voice that somehow commanded absolute attention, "I have asked you here this evening because I believe we have all been the victims of an elaborate deception, one that culminated in the murder of Alfred Dobson." A murmur ran through the assembled company at this direct statement, but Miss Marple continued with unperturbed calm. "The deception began with this document," she said, producing the closure notice that had started the entire sequence of events. At first glance, it appears to be a legitimate order from the Rural District Council, but closer examination reveals it to be a forgery of considerable sophistication. She proceeded to demonstrate each element of the fraud: the wrong paper stock bearing the Waverly Bond watermark used by the Women's Institute, the oval typeface characteristic of the Remington machine kept in the parish room's cupboard, the non-existent bylaw citation, and the traced signature that began above rather than at the baseline. Most significantly, she continued, holding up the document for all to see, the red wax seal bears the reversed impressions of letters R and S, the mark of a business stamp pressed beneath the wax to create the illusion of official authority. Basil shifted slightly in his chair, but maintained his expression of polite attention. The seal itself was created using decorative Christmas wax, the cinnamon-scented variety sold for craft purposes rather than official correspondence, melted in what I believe was a candle spoon, and then pressed over the forger's own business stamp. Miss Marple moved to the Remington typewriter that had been brought from the WI cupboard for demonstration purposes. The machine used to type this fraudulent notice is still warm to the touch, indicating recent use, and bears traces of red wax in the candle spoon found nearby. She then directed attention to the partition mechanism itself, where the fatal accident had occurred. Mr. Dobson's death was not the result of mechanical failure, but of deliberate sabotage accomplished with considerable ingenuity. Moving to the upper right release pin, she demonstrated how a knitting needle could be used to prop the mechanism in an apparently secure but actually precarious position. The pin was held barely in place by this improvised wedge, which would remain stable until deliberately disturbed by external force. That external force, Miss Marple continued, producing the length of Mercer's twine discovered behind the notice board, was provided by this cord, commercial packaging string with a distinctive red tracer thread. One end shows the smooth polish of repeated passage over wood, while the other bears the clean cut of deliberate severing. She traced the path of the cord from the partition pin, over the platform rail behind the notice board, and under the side door to the yard beyond. When Mr. Dobson opened the door to begin his inspection, the person waiting outside had only to pull this cord. The knitting needle would slip free, the pin would fall, and the partition would crash down upon anyone standing beneath it. The demonstration was conducted with a substitute mechanism that showed exactly how the device would have operated, causing several members of the audience to gasp at its deadly simplicity. The cherry red wool fiber caught in the partition runner matches exactly the double knitting wool sold by Rudge & Son, Miss Marple observed, producing the ball band found in Dobson's wastebasket. This wrapper had its cardboard inner core removed, exactly what would be needed to create a neat spool for winding the trigger cord. She moved to the stage area where Lottie discovered the mysterious polish. This specialized preparation contains cloves rather than the paraffin base used by our caretaker. It's a sort of product used for maintaining window displays and wooden fixtures, a professional requirement for someone in the haberdashery trade. As for motive, Miss Marple continued, returning to face her audience. Mr. Dobson's records reveal a scheme of considerable ambition. Mr. Rudge had booked the parish rooms for Wednesday evening under false pretenses, intending to use the forged closure notice to evict the regular tenants and then offer them alternative accommodation in his own premises at nearly double the current rent. She produced the draft letter found in Dobson's files. The plan was to create a captive market for his newly renovated back room by making the parish rooms unavailable through fraudulent official action. But Alfred Dobson was too conscientious an official to accept suspicious documentation without investigation. His diary shows growing concern about the closure notice's authenticity, and he had arranged to inspect the premises that very evening. Miss Marple's voice took on a grave quality as she reached the climax of her exposition. Faced with the certainty that his fraud would be discovered, Mr. Rudge chose murder over exposure. He prepared the partition trap, positioned his trigger mechanism, and waited outside until his victim arrived to conduct the inspection that would have ruined him. The silence in the room was profound as the full implications of this reconstruction became clear. All eyes turned to Basil Rudge, whose carefully maintained composure had begun to crack under the weight of accumulated evidence. "This is all very ingenious theorizing," he said with forced lightness. "But surely you cannot expect anyone to believe such an elaborate fantasy based on a few scraps of string and some coincidental similarities in office supplies." Miss Marple regarded him with the mild attention she might give to an interesting but not particularly threatening insect. "Perhaps you're right, Mr. Rudge. Perhaps it is all coincidence that you purchased sealing wax and copying pencils on Tuesday, posted a large envelope after hours that same evening, had access to the parish rooms and knowledge of the partition mechanism, used the distinctive red fleck twine found at the murder scene, and possess both the motive and opportunity to commit this crime. She paused, allowing the full weight of evidence to settle upon the assembled company. But then again, perhaps not. Inspector Slack stepped forward with the authority of official justice. Basil Rudge, I am arresting you for the murder of Alfred Dobson. You're not obliged to say anything, but anything you do say may be given in evidence. As Rudge was led away, his facade of respectability finally crumbling into desperate protests of innocence, Miss Marple folded her hands and reflected that justice, while sometimes delayed, had a way of asserting itself through the careful observation of small details. So domestic, so tidy, Lady Bantry murmured, as they watched the partition mechanism being secured in its proper position. And so cruel, Miss Marple nodded quietly. Yes, my dear. Forgers always dress their lies in proper headings and little seals, but paper has watermarks, and even the neatest contrivance leaves a fiber caught in the grease. Peace.